We are in the middle of the book of Deuteronomy, and we left off, I believe, in chapter 13 last week, so that's where we'll pick up this morning. Deuteronomy chapter 13. Just to remind ourselves again, this outline of the book, that Deuteronomy is primarily organized in the manner of a covenant treaty. A lot of the ancient peoples had covenant treaties between one civilization and the other, but this one is special because it is a treaty between God and between His people Israel. And of course, we see that it follows this outline here. The biggest section, chapters 12 through 26, details the specific rules, the specific laws that God expects Israel to follow if they are to stay within this covenant relationship with Him. And chapter 13 in particular deals with this problem of idolatry. A lot of the chapters in Deuteronomy deal with idolatry, if you haven't noticed that yet. But chapter 13 really breaks into three parts. The first 5 verses, which we talked about last week, are if a prophet promotes idolatry, and that's any prophet, even if he makes a prediction that comes true, even if he performs a sign that comes true. And what are you supposed to do with a prophet that promotes idolatry? You are supposed to kill him. You are not supposed to listen to him, even if he performs signs that come true. Verses 6 through 11 is the second part, when your family members promote idolatry. And verses 12 through 18 is when a city promotes idolatry. So let's start in verse 6. That's where we left off. If your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul entice you, secretly saying, "Let's go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end, you shall not yield to him or listen to him. Your eye shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him, but you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and will never again do such a wicked thing among you. Now, that command seem a little counterintuitive to you? Don says no. What does counterintuitive mean? Maybe I should have asked that. That was what Jenna asked me when she was filling out the workbook here. She's like, do people know what counterintuitive means? It means it's not something you would normally want. It's not something that you would normally react in this way. You would not naturally do this. Is this something that, we as people would naturally want to do? Don?
Well, no, not upon our own. If we have respect for the Word of God,
okay,
and His statutes, then it would be something.
Well, yes, that's the ultimate point that's being brought across here. Our society teaches us to think a little bit differently than this, though, don't they?
Jesus teaches, if we're going to follow Him, I mean, it's likely we're going to hate brother and daughters and sons and stuff.
Right.
That's the price we pay for service to God.
Right. Matthew chapter 10 and verses 34 through 37, Jesus states this principle about the priority of God and family. Actually, he says it about himself, which is implicitly a claim that he is God. Jesus says in Matthew 10 in verses 34 through 37, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it." Luke chapter 14 and verse 26 words it even more strongly. Large crowds were going along with him. He turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children, and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." What does this say about the priority of God and family? God comes first. Right, God comes first. But this is my family member. I love them. Well, that's the person. And Deuteronomy even says that. It says this is your friend who is as your own soul. You love them as your own soul. Which really, that's supposed to be true of anybody. Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don.
Consider Abraham. God gave him a son. Nobody. We don't know what was done to him.
Right.
But he took Isaac.
Right.
And that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to do exactly what God wanted him to do. Because he knew that God said that he was
Mark.
When my father obeyed the gospel, he came home to his mother, who said, well, it just seemed like you're not really my son anymore.
No.
When my first mother-in-law was baptized at 17 years of age, she didn't know if she would be allowed back in the house. That was Mom Allen. I know another young lady that went home after being baptized, and her brother beat her almost to death and threw her out the back door like a piece of trash and just left her there. And my daughter-in-law was also 17 when she was baptized, and her parents forbid her to leave the house on Sunday except for a short bicycle ride that she got to take on Sunday night. And she would sneak to services, and they would, when they saw her come in the back door, they would immediately stop and serve the Lord's Supper because they knew she only had about 15 minutes before she had to go back home. These are just modern examples of exactly what you've talked about in these scriptures. A lot of people will say, oh, but I can't do that because of my mother and father and I love them so much. Well, who do you love more? And if you don't love God more, our children are not ours. Our children are just loaned to us for a short period of time. They belong to God. And as parents, that needs to be our attitude about it. And our attitude toward our parents needs to be, yeah, we love them, we respect them insofar as we can, but we have to put God first.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, this passage in Deuteronomy says something about yes, Kathleen, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. I'm not particularly, I don't think that we should be trying to, suppress the meaning of the word at the same time. I think Jesus uses an intentionally strong word to get you to think, is more the idea here. If we say it means love less, we just kind of... I've heard that before. I don't know if that's true or not. I've heard that before. That sounds like one of those explanations we try to make to soften the blow of the passage. And I'm uncomfortable with using explanations to soften the blow of God's word. So, but that may be the case. I don't know. I'll just kind of say that there. Jenna.
So is it kind of like
when Esau despised his birthright, the idea is more that he thought he viewed it with he didn't view it very valuably at all. He viewed it with contempt. He thought very little of it. You think of
it was important.
He didn't think it was important. Well, he traded it for a bowl of stew. Yeah, so he didn't think it was important. Getting back to Deuteronomy 13. In Deuteronomy 13, it just shows how extreme this whole idea is. Killing your family members for leading you away from God, that sounds a little extreme. Exposing the secret idolaters in your family. Well, society teaches us from a very early age not to tattle on people. That's something that I had drilled into my head from elementary school onwards. But God, by contrast, doesn't demand that. He demands that everything be kept above board, if you will. He demands that people not be secret idolaters hiding behind closed doors, but that people be honest. And there's a loyalty to God that comes before loyalty to family. This passage is not anti-family, but rather anti-idolatry. The fact that the person is stoned is significant as well. Why would God choose stoning as a form of execution, as opposed to, firing squad or hanging or...
I don't think that's bullets.
Well, they didn't have bullets back then. Okay, so, beheading, More painful...
I've never been stoned.
Well, there's also an element of this that the entire community needs to be involved in it. As opposed to one guy executing him, it's the whole community has to be involved in his execution, because the whole community must repudiate that sin. It gets back to the principle from verse 5, you shall purge the evil from among you. It's not just one person that must reject the sin of that's going on within them. It's the whole community must reject that sin. And then the whole nation will hear about it, and they will fear. The first stone must be thrown by the accuser. And a strict zero-tolerance policy will motivate Israel not to behave this way anymore. That statement, all Israel will hear and be afraid, recurs several more times in Deuteronomy, in chapters 17 and 19 and 21. That's the basic direction that we're going with that. Any questions up to verse 11, or comments, or other interjections? Verse 12, if you hear in one of your cities which the Lord your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some worthless men have gone out from among you and have seduced the inhabitants of their city, saying, let's go and serve other gods whom you have not known, then you shall investigate and search out and inquire thoroughly. And if it is true and the matter established that this abomination has been done among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying it, and all that is in it, and its cattle with the edge of the sword. You shall gather all its booty into the middle of its open square, and burn the city and all its booty with fire as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And it shall be a ruin forever, it shall never be rebuilt. Nothing from that which is put under the ban shall cling to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his burning anger and show mercy to you and have compassion on you and make you increase, just as he has sworn to your fathers. If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments, which I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. So, a city promotes idolatry. Somebody hears a rumor, a city has succumbed to a cult of idolatry, worthless men, literally sons of Belial. And what are they told to do first? Investigate. Don't act impulsively, right? Make sure you establish your facts first. And if the matter is true, the city must be utterly destroyed. And, he goes into this detailed description of just how extensive the destruction is. Does this remind us of anything else we have read previously in Deuteronomy? The way that the city is supposed to be destroyed? Is this something that Israel had never done to was never going to do to any other city other than this kind? Jenna. Okay, yeah, this is what they were supposed to do to the Canaanite cities, wasn't it? Deuteronomy 7 talks quite a bit, extensively, about how they were to go into Canaan. They were to utterly destroy the inhabitants of the land, burn their cities with fire, burn it down, even burn the spoils in it. And, in verse 16 he gives the comment, it shall never be rebuilt. It sounds a lot like Jericho, actually. In Joshua chapter 6, they go into the land, they burn the city of Jericho, they take all the spoil. The people can't spoil the city because it's under the ban, Joshua says. So much so that anyone who violates the ban goes under the ban themselves, in the case of Achan in Joshua 7. But Joshua pronounces a curse in Joshua chapter 6, in verse 26, against anyone who ever rebuilt the city of Jericho. He says that with the death of his firstborn son will he lay the foundation, and with the death of his youngest son will he set up its gates. There's a...
And that was fulfilled.
And that was fulfilled later on in 1 Kings 16, I think. But what winds up happening here is that we have the same term for utter destruction of the Canaanites and the Amalekites being used of the destruction of idolatrous cities. And in fact, in Exodus 22 and verse 20, the same word is used as well. That anyone who worships other gods or sacrifices to other gods shall be utterly destroyed. The idolatrous cities are basically pronounced Canaanite, if you will, and put into that same category. But what's interesting is he says that this city will be offered up as a whole burnt offering. What's that mean? Don.
Well, I'm going to take a stab at it. When you consider that the best that you had to offer when you were going to offer a burnt offering. Here it is. I mean, it's a soothing aroma to it. Well, when you cook all this stuff,
Okay.
I mean, that may not be what.
Well, soothing. Well, no. There's a lot of points of comparison, I think, and that's probably one of them. The idea of a soothing aroma. Yeah, Mark.
Well, this is these are people who are taking something that God has given them and they are corrupting it to suit themselves.
Okay.
So God says, when you see that happen, you're going to bring it back to me. You know, what man does is not going to work. God is always going to have His way, and His will is always going to be performed, no matter what. And so when this city goes off into this city that I have given you, that you have not built, that, you know, I've given you vineyards that you have not planted, and you take them and you use them for corrupt means, then the rest of Israel is to come in, and they are to devote that city back to me, and it will be mine forevermore. Meaning they bring it in and they burn it up as a sacrifice to God Almighty. So this corrupt thing becomes pure. I remember, was it Isaiah that said that I cannot speak the word of God for I have unclean lips? And the angel brought the coal and placed it on his lips to purify his lips and said, now go preach. You know, the idea of burning with fire and purifying something with fire is kind of consistent throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah, and we actually saw that earlier in Numbers 31 even, whenever they attacked the cities of the Midianites, they took all the spoil. Before they could take the spoil, some of it had to be passed through the fire to be purged from the contamination of the community it was taken from. Don?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's Mark's point. Purify others.
Yeah.
Gets rid of that impurity. One of Peter's letters or James, well, when he talks about fire ordeal. Fire, you are tried.
Right. Well, and just to add another element or dimension to all of this, and you know, and these are all good points that we're bringing out here. But if we go back all the way back to Leviticus, where they really talked about what the burnt offering was. Anybody remember what the purpose of the burnt offering was? Explicitly stated purpose in Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4. Huh? Hint. Atonement. Yes, thank you. Atonement. Burnt offerings. Now, burnt offerings are unique in Leviticus in that they are the only sacrifice where the entire animal is put on the altar and burned. In some of the other sacrifices, a portion of the animal the priests would eat. In the peace offerings, the priest would eat a portion and the worshiper would eat a portion. But with the burnt offering, nobody ate anything. The whole thing was burned up. And it was the most commonly offered sacrifice. You had to offer at least 2 every day, usually more. But there's an emphasis on the wholeness. There's an emphasis on the atonement. That those people who commit sin must offer a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering to atone for their sin. And they do that willingly. God instructs them how they may atone for their sins, but they still do that willingly. But what if somebody refuses to offer a burnt offering to atone to their sin? Perhaps what if somebody is not willing to honor God? What if someone is not willing to treat God as holy? Well, what happens then? Sin still has to be atoned for. Somebody's going to atone for it. There's a sense in which they become a burnt offering to atone for their own sins. Now, that doesn't mean they're forgiven. That doesn't mean the inhabitants are going to get away with anything. It means that the sin still has to be paid for in some respect. there is a sense in which those who willingly refuse to honor the true God will forcibly honor Him when they themselves become the burnt offering. We think of Leviticus chapter 10, whenever Nadab and Abihu, they offer strange fire before the Lord. And what does he say? Fire comes out from the Lord and consumes them. And he says in verse 3, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy. Before all the people, I shall be honored. Well, Nadab and Abihu didn't treat you as holy, God. Not willingly, no. They were unwilling to treat me as holy, so I had to turn them into a burnt offering by which they would honor me in a more forcible fashion. And so that is another dimension to this whole burnt offering. The city, it may be that, yes, it's a soothing aroma to God. It's a rededication of a city to God that has, He gave to them, they misused it, and He takes it back. There's also a need, though, to atone for the sin of idolatry as well. By this burning, if you will, to purify the people and purge the evil from their midst. So that's another thought that was just a thought I had while reading it that I thought was interesting. I was, curious if y'all had reflections on that. But those are all some good points on burnt offerings. Any other comments or questions on this before we move on? Oh, there's another instance of it, yeah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah, idolatry is never mentioned, but homosexuality is, and there's a whole... It's still sin. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, he calls it an abomination. He calls, Deuteronomy 13 calls idolatry an abomination in verse 14 here, actually. It's important to note that. All right, but it shows something that loyalty to God comes before everything else. It even comes before the value of human life. Think about that for a second. That's a real political sticking point for a lot of people these days is the concept of pro-life, and that's important. But more important than that even is being pro-God, being loyal to God. If we don't have that, then all of the rest of it is just totally goes out the window. In chapter 14, you are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for His own possession, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. You shall not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals which you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Any animal that divides the hoof and the hoof splits in two and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those that divide the hoof in two: the camel and the rabbit and the chafin, for though they chew the cud, they do not divide the hoof. They are unclean for you. The pig, because it divides the hoof, but does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. You shall not eat any of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Anything that has fins and scales you may eat, but anything that does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It is unclean for you. You may eat any clean bird, but these are the ones which you shall not eat: the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the red kite, the falcon, the kite in their kinds, every raven in its kind, the ostrich, the owl, the seagull, the hawk in their kinds, the little owl, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the carrion vulture, the cormorant, the stork, and the heron in their kinds, and the hoopoe, and the bat. And all the teeming life with wings are unclean to you. They shall not be eaten. You may eat any clean bird. I didn't know the bat was a bird, but I'm sure he means flying things by that. He's not using our taxonomic classification system here. We'll talk about the food laws in a second, but first of all, what's significant about the way this chapter begins? What's he say? Who are you? Sons of God. And he's mentioned this before, Deuteronomy 1:31. God carried them as a son. Deuteronomy 8:5, God disciplined Israel as a son. Collectively, Israel is God's son. Exodus 4:22, God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Individually, Israelites are also God's sons. We talked about this in Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 1, he talks about sons I have reared and brought up, but they have turned from me. Israel is not just sons, they are rebellious sons. Now, of course, the reversal of that is that Jesus is the true Son of God who comes and acts as the obedient son that Israel was supposed to be. Jesus comes and succeeds where Israel has failed. But their sonship, what does it mean to be sons of God? What does that demand from us, according to this passage? Obedience? Yeah.
A sense of belonging to the family, I guess.
A sense of belonging to the family?
Totality of it.
Right. Being part of the family. What about Deuteronomy 14? What's the text say? Yeah, I mean, the sonship definitely implies a familial relationship, but it implies something else too. Yes, that you are a holy people. Restates the principle is all over Leviticus. You are to be holy because the Lord your God is holy. And because God is holy, well, God's holy character demands that His sons be holy as well. Just as children are supposed to look a little bit like their parents, Israel's supposed to look a little bit like God, aren't they? God chose Israel to be His own possession out of all the peoples on the face of the earth. Right. 1 Peter 1 and verse 14 or 15, I think. You shall be holy, for I am holy. 1 Peter 2, verse 8. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. There's a whole host of these types of passages in the Bible. So he starts off in chapter 14 saying, you're sons and you need to be holy. And then he starts talking about food laws. Okay, all right. Now, well, first of all, Mark, you got something?
One thing I noticed here, it says in verse 1, you shall not cut yourselves, nor shave your head, nor shave the front of your head for the dead, and so forth.
I meant to talk about that. Thanks for bringing it up.
Cutting yourself, what does that have to do with? Well, when Elijah went up against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal were calling out to Baal, and according to the Boy Scout skit we did on this, they were calling out, come on Baal, light our fire. But anyway, and they began to cut themselves so that they bled. Now, what is it that purifies? It's the shedding of blood that purifies one.
Right.
What kind of blood does it take to purify sins? It takes holy blood of a completely righteous person. The problem with cutting yourself, as I see it, and understanding this from the whole perspective of the New Covenant as well as the Old Covenant, is that the blood of human beings wasn't good enough to do anything about the problem of sin. It took the blood of a sinlessly perfect human being to do this. And so the blood of bulls and goats could roll sin back, but their own blood was unable to do anything about their sinfulness. So they were not allowed to cut themselves in service to God because the shedding of their blood was worthless.
We could talk a very, very long time about the use of blood in the law. I don't know if I never made the connection to cutting yourselves. I got to think about that. Blood is one of those paradox things in the law. It has the power to cleanse if it's used correctly, but it also has the power to defile. And we're going to see more of this when we get later on. We start talking about bloodshed in chapters 19 and 20 and 21. If somebody shed innocent blood, if they killed somebody without a good reason, that bloodshed now defiles the ground. And it has to be atoned for by using blood the correct way. And so there's the kind of push and pull back and forth between blood being used to defile things and blood being used to purify things. And it all depends on whether or not you're using it as God sees fit. Now, cutting yourself, that's clearly the practice of the pagans of that time. They would cut themselves to try to appease their pagan gods to listen to them. And similar to the number of other rituals, there's a whole host of other pagan-type rituals that are not mentioned in chapter 14 that are mentioned elsewhere. But here in this instance, it seems to me that it's going against this idea of holiness. Leviticus chapter 19 talked about this as well. Leviticus chapter 19 in verses 27 and 28. We're getting close to the end, and I'm not going to get to talk about the food laws. We were talking about this before class. Verse 27, you shall not round off the side growth of your heads, nor harm the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. Now the comment in verse 28 indicates that they would have been doing this for the dead. Now in the case of Baal, they were trying to call on a god that was not really a living god, so I guess he was dead too. They didn't think that, but there's a connection with that. But apparently, the pagans would have cut themselves, perhaps as a means of necromancy or a means of communing with the dead spirits or whatnot, and that was forbidden in the law. Witchcraft and necromancy and sorcery, those types of things were forbidden. So much so that when Saul goes to consult a medium, and consult the medium to find, to talk to Samuel from the dead, Samuel comes and talks to him. I don't think the medium was expecting that. But then later on in Chronicles, it says that God killed Saul specifically because he sought the counsel of a medium. Because he went to these pagan sources to try to commune with God. Was that a comment, or was that something, an electronic device making noise? Okay. Gotta love the digital age. No, but that's another point to bring out. The holiness means abstaining from and refraining from these pagan practices. Being God's children means abstaining from these ideas of the world. You are no longer a child of this world. You are no longer a son of this realm. You are a son of God. And you must behave as God would have you behave, as your Father. He talks about food laws in verses 3 through 21. And first of all, what's the apparent basis for them? He talks about holiness, and this is actually a much shorter discussion than the one we had in Leviticus 11. What appear to be the basic principle, the rationale for what's clean and unclean?
God is teaching them here that there's a difference between them. Going back, I think to the root, my never be humble opinion is that going back all the way to the root, God is teaching them that there's a difference between them and everyone else, and they have to act in a certain way, and other people will act differently, but you don't go after them. And so here we have clean animals, and some of these animals that were unclean, actually, if not prepared properly, would have been unhealthy to eat. But that's not really the point. Some people have brought this up.
Yeah.
Like circumcision, whatever, however you say it, could be a hygiene measure. Well, that wasn't the point of that. It was something to separate them from everyone else and give them laws and ordinances that they needed to observe to teach them that they were a special people, reserved for God's own special purpose.
Right.
And that was really the point of all of this. Now,
no, I think you're absolutely right about that, yeah. There was a book that was really popular a while back called None of These Diseases, which talk about how the Old Testament laws were all about health measures and things like that. I don't see a lot of evidence of that, and it's one of the. I don't think God would tell His people to do something that was just totally self-destructive. But I don't see the evidence that because if God's concerned about being healthy in these food laws, why doesn't He talk about poisonous plants? And why are they suddenly abrogated in the New Testament? Does God no longer care how His people eat? The real point seems to be the distinction that God is making between the people. And Leviticus 11 talks about the need to make distinctions between the clean and the unclean, between the holy and the common. And Israel must make themselves holy even in what they eat. Even the very process of eating says something about who you are as a person. Now, he gives them two principles. Animals, the way the animals move, it must divide the hoof. And the way the animals eat, must chew the cud, which is really don't impose our modern definition of chew the cud on that. What he means is that you're supposed to they chew their food thoroughly, is what it means. And of course, you see that with fish, fins and scales, the way they move. And you see that with birds. He doesn't explain the principle why these birds are listed, but they all appear to have one thing in common. They're all birds of prey. They eat other animals. So it seems to be that the way they eat is, again, the criteria. Now, so close to out of time, don't have time to go to all these fun New Testament passages about this. Mark?
can we maybe take that up next week? But
Yeah.
one thing that has occurred to me, and this is not stated about this in the New Testament, but we do read in the New Testament that God made the law about not muzzling the ox that treadeth out the grain. And he said God didn't care about oxen. He did that to teach you to pay the preacher, essentially. I'm paraphrasing very loosely there. But he did that to teach you to pay the preacher. So God made some laws in the Old Testament to teach principles that he really intended to be completely applied in the New Testament. And I just, this is just a thought. I'm not saying this is it, because I don't know. But I wonder if God might not have set this up, at least in large part, because he was planning on teaching Peter the principle that what I have made clean is clean, and you don't call it unclean, and so now the Gentiles are clean. And so these laws had to do, God was thinking ahead and thinking, I'm going to usher the Gentiles into my kingdom, and I need to make some laws to make that point clear.
That's part of the right answer. We'll talk about it in detail next time. Yeah, but that's on to something. There's one other... We'll look at some New Testament passages about this next time. We'll take a little break and we'll resume at 11.